There we go. Good morning. We're just going ahead and admitting everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Excellent, thank you. Just admitting everyone. Good morning. Excellent to be here. Beautiful. Excellent. We're so happy to be here today. Thank you for joining us for today's session on gender equality benefits everyone. My name is Kathy Gibson. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Senior Project Manager and Consultant for TAP Network, Technology and People Networks, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Tech Portfolio of Work. We're thrilled to continue to offer the Resource Hub and these EDIB learning opportunities. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here with everyone today. We can go to the next slide. I'll be starting with a welcome and land acknowledgement shortly, followed by an introduction to our fantastic speaker here today. We've got Tina Strelka, who is joining us, CEO from Minerva, longtime colleague and friend, and just she has such a tremendous amount of wisdom in this space to share. So we're so happy to have her here with us today. And I'm going to be passing things off to her. She's going to be speaking to how gender equality benefits everyone and dive into some really interesting pieces around how this can be impactful in your workplaces and you know what are the trends and what's happening in this space. Followed by some Q&A. If you have questions throughout, feel free to direct them directly to me through the chat function. You can pop them in publicly as well as you prefer. And we'll also, of course, be acknowledging our sustainability partners and at the end of the session as well. I'd like to just move to a land acknowledgement. And I would encourage you, if you know the land that you are on, I would love it if you might share that with us all in the chat. I am going to do that for everyone here as well as I continue to admit a couple of folks. And I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in downtown Vancouver. I'm so grateful to be on these lands and to live and work and just know that they've been taken care of for many generations before we came. I would like to just very briefly share a little passage from this beautiful book. It's Richard Wagamese Embers, and it's a beautiful, just brief meditation book that was gifted to us from our partners on we've been working on various projects over the years, and I just wanted to share just a brief passage if I might, and then we'll be moving on. I live for miracles in my life these days, not the earth-changing, light-bringing, soul-powering kind, but the ones that carve out small space of peace, where before there was a jumble of resentment, fear, and doubt, the ones that happen from choosing to live the right way. Like coming to understand that forgiveness isn't about gaining a release from others, it's about gaining a release from me. If I release my hold on what binds me, I can walk free and unencumbered. But I have to embrace the resentment, fear, and doubt to gain that. I have to own them, hold them again, so that I can learn to let them go. And that letting go is a miracle. So it's such a beautiful book of just all these amazing, gorgeous passages. And I just, I'll share it in the chat as well. And with that, next slide, I'm so thrilled to share and pass the floor off to Tina. Tina founded Minerva in 1999. Well, Minerva was founded as a registered charity in 1999, and Tina is the CEO. And she has more than 15 years of senior leadership experience in career development, education, and social impact sectors. She has knowledge and expertise in gender equality, inclusive leadership, and creating equitable workplaces. Tina has a bachelor's in arts in international relations from UBC and a master's of arts and communications from Royal Roads. And she's lived in Germany, Costa Rica, Guyana, and Taiwan. Tina currently volunteers with her mentors and young women in business UBC and is a member of Essential Impact Advisory Group as well. And I'm going to pass the floor off to Tina and share with you a little bit about her with her LinkedIn profile in the chat. Thanks so much, Tina.
Thank you, Kathy, for that warm welcome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning to chat and talk a little bit about gender equity in the workplace. Of course, we had International Women's Day last Friday, and there have been many, many events. I hope you've had opportunity to attend some of them. March is really a fun month because there is so much going on and so much celebration, recognition, and important conversations that happen. And sometimes it feels like all of Minerva's work is trying to get done in this one month. But I'm grateful that you're here. As mentioned, I'm Tina Strelka. I'm the CEO of Minerva BC. I've been there about 8 years. I'm not the founder. Minerva was founded by some amazing women 25 years ago who wanted to make it easier for the next generation. So they had found success in business, career, government, and thought that they could provide some economic, leadership, educational opportunities that would help sort of accelerate progress and accelerate opportunities for women and girls in their careers and in leadership. So today, Minerva really does focus on those economic and leadership opportunities. We do a number of things, so I'll share a little bit about our work. We do leadership programs for girls and women. We start with youth in high school. We start grades 10 to 12 with self-identified girls, gender diverse youth. And we do this because this is an age and stage where a lot of young women start to close doors before they've even explored things. So this is a stage where we're really encouraging youth to understand who they are, what they're good at, understand the value of mentorship, and start to think about how they can think about themselves as leaders, how they can think about careers and opportunities that might be non-traditional, and really encourage them not to say no to things before they've explored them. We also have programs for women in careers. So our emerging leaders is for early leaders, people who are moving from individual contributor to manager or starting to lead teams. And Women Leading the Way supports women mid-career, usually a manager director level, a spot where women often get stuck in their careers and sort of lag behind in promotions to senior leadership. Minerva also works with organizations. So we do learning opportunities like this webinar. We do some research. Part of what I'm talking about today will be based on a research report we did last year, looking at sort of the state of workplaces and what men and women are experiencing in the BC workplace. We also do an inclusive leadership forum every September during Gender Equality Week. So if you like what you hear here or want to learn more about what we're doing, that's a spot where we bring together lots of speakers, businesses, organizations, academics to just talk about how do we create inclusive workplaces where everyone can thrive. So thank you for being here. Let's jump right into the content. What I'm going to talk about today, so I've already covered me, covered Minerva, that's covered. I'm going to start with some current context, so facts and data. I always like to say that facts and data don't change hearts and minds, but it does sort of give us a baseline for where we're at and what the current context is and where we should point our attention to some of the problems and the gaps that still exist. We'll talk a bit about workplace norms and sort of understanding some of the norms that still impact and create those visible and invisible barriers in the workplace. And then we'll talk a little bit about some ideas for action. So is gender equality in the workplace still an issue? I chose this photo because I feel like sometimes when I tell people what I do, what my work is, I sometimes get this reaction or sort of this look like, is that still a problem in Canada? Is that still a problem in British Columbia? Do women really still have it sort of so bad in the workplace? So I just invite you to sort of take a pause and take a moment to think about your own experience or what you've heard about and consider, like, how would you answer this question? Is gender equality in the workplace still an issue here in British Columbia? If you're comfortable, you can put your response in the chat. So this is a question we asked in our research study last year, and my team was very surprised at the outcome. So in general, we found that most people in British Columbia that we surveyed think that gender equality is not an issue, that it has been solved, that it has been achieved in the workplace. So 70% of women in BC, 76% of men in BC. I'm just going to pause here and say a lot of the data that I'm going to share will sort of take it from a binary perspective of man, woman. We did ask for different dimensions of diversity, different gender identities, but we didn't get enough data back to be able to comment with any validity about other genders. So it is going to feel pretty binary, but I want to acknowledge that we know that the perspectives are definitely beyond those two positions. But again, the majority of people in BC don't think that gender equality is a problem in the workplace. So my team, of course, we live and breathe these topics. We talk to women every day in our leadership programs. We know what they experience. We hear about it. We see where there are gaps that impact their wage, their promotion, their progression, how they can influence their power. So for us, we were like, how is this possible? How can folks think that this is not an issue anymore? And when we dug a little bit deeper into the content, we really realized that sort of on the surface, while there is this sort of majority opinion that, you know, this is probably not the biggest issue anymore, when we looked at all the other indicators throughout our research report, we could see that there were differences in every case where men and women were sharing different experiences, and that generally women were lagging behind in all of those indicators. So that's where we kind of looked and said, there's not one gotcha statistic in our report, but when we look overwhelmingly at all the questions asked and can see that there is still this gap in experience, in progression, in promotion, we can still see that the experiences of men and women in the workplace are quite different. So we'll look a little bit of stats of representation. So stats and like bums and seats and people sort of in roles don't really tell a story, because you can definitely have tokenism where, you know, your proportion of women representation can look better, but if actually there's not true influence or contribution or sort of power shared, then it's not really true equity and equality in the workplace. So we know that our stats in Canada and that the women's experiences do tell a different story. This is data that comes from the Prosperity Project. The Prosperity Project is a national charity. They were formed during COVID, and one of the best things that they do is they do an annual report where they collect and gather data from corporate organizations across the country to sort of showcase where are we at in Canada with these roles. And it provides a bit of a benchmark. You can see a bit by industry and the types of organizations. And it really paints a picture that the majority of power, the majority of leadership roles in Canada in the corporate sector still very much are held by men. So nearly 70% in the categories, right? So executive officer roles, 68%, corporate director roles, 66%, senior manager roles, 61%. And when we look at this, it doesn't support the other places in Canada where we have closed the gender gap. So Canada has closed the gender gap around education. We graduate pretty equal numbers, sometimes a little bit more women than men, but pretty much equal numbers of people are attending post-secondary, graduating with degrees. We're not seeing gaps anymore in educational outcomes or, you know, so the tools and readiness to be able to contribute in the labor market in a significant way. So this doesn't tell us the full story of why there isn't more balance and more women sort of coming up in the ranks of leadership. When we look even deeper, Prosperity Project is collecting intersectional data, so they are asking questions about other identity factors to understand how it might be different for different groups within the labor market. And when they try to sort of share a number or a stat on Black, Indigenous, women of color, really the best they can do is sort of put all those roles together. So senior leadership, executive officer, corporate director, you take all those roles together and we have about 10% representation by Black, Indigenous, women of color. So again, we can see that there's a barrier to progression for women and then women who have identity factors, because we should be seeing more of a balance in the ranks as people are coming up. So this tells us that there is something going on. We can't attribute this solely to women opting out or not wanting leadership, because just as many men and other gender diverse people opt out of the labor market for same reasons of not wanting the pressure or wanting to have more balance. So we're not getting the full story here of why we're not able to break through this 30% representation number that we have, and even less for women with diverse identities. When we looked into our research study and what we were sort of gleaning from what we were hearing from people in the workplace, in general, the story was that women felt they had more barriers and less access to opportunities to help them advance their careers. And I want to pause here for a minute because I think this statement can start to get a little bit uncomfortable or start to kind of create that polarized feeling or so that wondering of like, but wait a minute, like our workplaces are equal. There aren't different rules for different employees. Most workplaces have the intention to create wonderful, amazing places where people can thrive and grow their careers and want to retain those employees. So the intention is not to hold anyone back. And yet we don't have the same outcomes and we have these inequitable outcomes. So when we say things like women face more barriers and they have less access, I think it's important to note that that isn't necessarily by design from an intentional place to say we want to hold back, but it is sort of embedded in systems and structures that were created and built at a time where women weren't necessarily as valued in some of those roles and in some of those types of organizations. And the legacy and the history of that, and then the social sort of bias and norms that we've formed around that are the conditions that create those barriers and those impediments to progression. So when you hear this and when you think about it and you think about your workplace and think, but nothing's getting in the way. Everyone has equal opportunity. Women can do exactly what men can do. They can apply for the same jobs. They can apply for the same promotions. That's all true. But it's when we sort of dig into the ways that we make those decisions, the way that we make assessments of people, the way that we sort of apply and implement our bias into those networks, that the outcomes become different. So we'll dig into this a little bit because it comes down to sort of stereotypes and beliefs about the workplace. In our research report, women said that they had less access to leadership development and training. They had fewer opportunities to lead critical assignments, so less opportunities for those stretch assignments or here, take a shot, grab this project, do something that maybe raises their profile in the organization. Women generally received nicer, less actionable feedback than men, often personality-based more so than performance or sort of like tactical things they could do. And they had less access to peer groups, senior leaders, and sponsorship. This bears out in other research. So Minerva's study said this, but when you read and dig and look at other information, this is very commonly cited as some of the gaps and the barriers of why women aren't sort of achieving the same economic and workplace outcomes as their male counterparts. So from our study, just a few stats. Again, there's no one gotcha example, but it kind of shows how that lag played out for us within our study. So for participating in leadership development, it was about an 11-point difference between men and women. So not a huge gap, but a gap. For opportunities to lead assignments, about a 15-point gap. So again, not a huge gap, but a gap. And so then you have a gap of like, I'm not getting leadership training. I'm not getting access to assignment. It starts to compound the effect. And the third one is being included by peers in leadership circles. So again, not a huge gap, but a gap. And when we start to see that this is a consistent experience of these like persistent gaps in all of the places, that's where it starts to compound and have a big impact on a career. And something like being included in peer and leadership circles, when we think about how this plays out in a workplace, again, this often isn't structured or intentional. This is often the informal ways that we build relationships, that we communicate about the business, that we learn about things happening. It's through the relationships that we form. And so if women have less access to peer groups, to senior leaders, to sponsorship, to these kind of opportunities where information is shared, where relationships are built, where things are being talked about in the business, these are often the kind of informal spaces where the opportunity for sponsorship blooms. Like it sort of is created through those relationships. People don't sponsor people if they don't know them, if they haven't built relationship, if there's not trust and sort of belief there. So if you have less access to those things, again, maybe not intentionally, But if you have less access, it does have a direct impact on your progression, on your career, on your promotion. So on a topic like this, you don't have to change everything in your organization. What you have to do is sort of be aware of, like, where do I have access to these kind of opportunities? Where do others have access to these opportunities? And sort of be aware of making sure that not all peer groups and all of these sort of like sponsorship potential relationship circles are exclusive or happening at times when not everyone can participate. So it's sort of just paying attention and being aware. And for as individuals, you can think about, like, who do I communicate most with at work? Who do I never communicate with? Who's never in these rooms, or who's not getting access to these kind of rooms, and how can you open that up and create it? Not every circle has to be open to everyone, but there have to be circles where everyone can sort of find a way in, if that makes sense. I'm just going to pause and see if there's any questions or comments on this information, this data. I can't see the chat, so I'm just curious if there's anything coming up for anyone before I continue on.
You get your comments here in the chat just yet, Tina, but I think, you know, I love this dialogue, and I'm wondering if you might, I loved your description of the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. And I wonder if maybe you could briefly just summarize that for context, because we're referring to sponsorship quite a bit. I think you've articulated what it is, but maybe just the difference for people in case they're unfamiliar.
Sure. So the way I think about this, and it's influenced by readings that I've done, it's not my own original thought, but I really like the idea and the model of mentorship as being on a continuum. So often we sort of think about mentorship as someone who takes you under their wing and shares experiences and gives advice. And mentorship on that level is really important at certain stages of career, like when you're first learning leadership, or you're just stepping into a new role and you really don't quite know what you're doing. It's very helpful to have someone like that who's a guide on the side. Mentorship needs to progress beyond advice giving and coaching and sort of like, you know, sharing your stories to help guide them. It needs to move into behaviors that are things like giving access to opportunity, opening up your network and introducing people to other people, talking about people when they're not in the room, advocating for stretch assignments or new jobs, advocating for promotion. Sponsorship moves into that realm where you use your social capital, where you use your clout, where you use your reputation to support someone else's career. And of course, that only happens when we know and believe and trust in someone. So how do you get to a space of sponsorship is you have to build relationship, and you have to get to know someone and know their work. I'm sure all of you have done work on unconscious bias. You've probably learned about that through workplace training and other things. But one of our most sort of entrenched unconscious biases is affinity bias. We really like people who are like us. So we're attracted to people who have similar backgrounds, experiences, whose kids are in the same sport, who went to the same schools we did, or had the same sort of upbringing we did. And if we sort of lean into that unconscious bias too far and don't sort of be conscious that we're bringing other people along, our mentorship and our sponsorship will always perpetuate that sort of homogenous type of employee, because we are activating that familiarity. So we have to sort of get more comfortable in using our mentorship and advancing our mentorship along the spectrum to be able to bring more people along. So this is some, oh, sorry, yeah, thanks, Kathy. Here's some data about women in tech. So I found this from an article that Sibyl Negris shared last week during International Women's Day. So she's obviously a leader in the sector and a real champion for women in technology. So this data comes from different places. Some of it's Canadian, some of it's US, but she posted this great article on LinkedIn, and it talked about really like needing to sort of like double down on efforts to support and retain women in technology. And so in Canada, she cited a statistic that said that in general, on average, women are earning about 20,000 less per year than their male counterparts in tech. 72% of women experience a bro culture at work. 50% are likely to quit tech by the age of 35, and 56 are likely to leave by mid-career. So that's like a significant brain drain out of the industry. And I want to pick up on one piece here about sort of the bro culture. I'm going to sort of move into a bit of this conversation of ideal worker and ideal leader, which I think is a little bit of a foundation for where a bro culture, or sort of a very masculine culture, sort of can come from. But what we learned in our survey of folks working in BC was that if you are someone who is not of a dominant group working within a dominant group, you're more likely to leave that because of that and because of the bias and the gender bias you experience. So we often think about male-dominated industries or historically male-dominated industries being difficult for women. But what we learned from our study was that even if you have a team that is sort of dominant in one way, male majority in one way, women in that grouping are also more likely to leave. So even if it's not a male dominant industry, if you're working on a male majority team, it can also create sort of more difficulties, barriers, challenges around gender inequities, and women are more likely to leave. So I think this problem of brain drain and loss of talent is the reason that we want to sort of dig in and figure out, well, how do we create workplaces that feel more equitable, that feel sort of more balanced? Because that's a really significant impact on all of our organizations. So understanding workplace norms and sort of stereotypes. I want to get into this a little bit around what's going on in the workplaces, or what's sort of happening when, I think for most of us, I'm sure many of you work for very progressive organizations who have very cutting edge HR policies and are sort of like really trying to lead and be workplaces that are responsive to employee needs and ensuring retention. I know that that's true for the majority of employers who want to create amazing workplaces where people can build their careers and stay for a long time. And yet there's still something going on here. And what is that? So for me, it's really thinking about the workplace norms and what's in the water, what's in the culture, like what's the space we're all swimming in that sometimes we're not even aware of and don't question. And I see this a lot now in our leadership programs where women will come into our program and say, I don't experience gender inequality. I don't experience bias. My workplace is amazing. I've never been held back because of my gender. But when then they start to come in and start to sort of look at the experiences they've had, where they've had success, where they've maybe not had much success, they can see where some of the unwritten rules in the workplace are holding them back because there is sort of a bias towards a certain type of work or a certain style of leadership. And most of the women we meet believe that they have to lead in a certain way to fit the mold of the company. And it's through coming through our programs and sort of like understanding, well, who am I and what's important to me and how do I want to lead that's authentic to me, that enables them to actually step into their full confidence and power and have way more impact than they would have before, because they're not trying to sort of fit a mold or a shape or an expectation. So let's get into some of those expectations. Ideal worker, ideal leader. So when we think about like how workplaces were formed, workplaces were really built for men, by men. And a lot of the systems and structures we have in our workplaces haven't changed that much. If you think about sort of hours of work and constructs of work and how it looks, some of the underlying beliefs that we still hold would be things like your career starts in early adulthood and keeps going till you retire, right? Finish high school, finish post-secondary, get going, get on that career, and then you're on the track until you retire. There's a strong bias towards full-time and full force. So people who work part-time tend to be seen as not as committed to career, maybe their work doesn't seem as valuable, and full force. So, you know, most of us are working outside of work hours, even though our employment agreements might say X number of hours a week. Most of us are putting in extra time. We check our email on the weekend, and we know that there's a consideration given for those when we do those behaviors that we're seen as dedicated and committed employees, and really sort of an ideal worker that is willing to like put in the extra effort or the extra time to get the job done. So full time and full force is really rewarded and valued generally by most of our workplaces. Upwards progression. So if you think about expectation of work and career, your own experience, what you might be thinking about for your kids if they're starting to get into the labor market, there is an expectation that we're sort of starting and we're progressing and we're climbing the ladder, we're moving up, next promotion, next job, more responsibility, more money. And that if someone deviates from that path, it is also not necessarily seen as sort of the ideal or the right way to do things in your career. So an idea of upward progression without stopping sort of also leads into that ideal worker, ideal leader. In earlier days, I think this is changing a lot and changing fast, but leaders and managers were really focused and rewarded for managing tasks and processes and systems and efficiencies, and not so much people. Managing people was like, get the work done, not necessarily engaging people on sort of personal issues, family issues, mental health, wellness issues. So like, keep that stuff away, keep that stuff at home. You're just here at work. We're dealing with work. A little bit more, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but a little bit more, so less focus on the human and the person and doing the work, but more on the outputs of the work. Ideal worker, ideal leader, sort of like older models would be seeing leaders as strong and dominant, superior, competitive, win at all costs. And I think that that's still prevalent in the stereotype of leadership. When we meet young women when we talk about leadership, some of them don't even want to take our program because it's called Learning to Lead. And they have an idea of leadership that is so far outside of who they see themselves as that they can't even imagine that they could be that. And some of it comes from this bias that leaders need to look and feel and act a certain way. And then finally, sort of in that ideal worker, ideal leader, that's sort of keeping emotions in check, right? Keeping the messiness outside of the workplace. Don't bring that to work. Emotions aren't welcome. Problems aren't welcome. Sort of like, come and do your job. So if we think about these traits, and again, most of these wouldn't sort of be written down in an employee handbook as saying we value these things. But if you really sort of like are quiet with yourself, think about your own value and belief system and what's being reinforced, either how you've been brought up or what you've learned or what you see sort of around you. Some of these things probably exist for all of us when we think about career and success and progression and leadership and sort of these ideals of how we're supposed to be. But all of these things sort of hold us in a mold, in a box, and in a space that doesn't work for everyone and increasingly doesn't work for most of us. So these norms are still influencing our workplace culture, even if it's not verbalized or if it's not sort of explicit, and it's not said in your handbook, like we expect you to work all hours of the day and night and check your email on the weekends. There are these sort of like unwritten expectations. And I'll give you an example of how this can kind of play out in a very tangible way that doesn't seem like it could happen, but does happen. We worked with an organization and they had sort of a period of where they were recognizing high potentials and identifying, who are we going to invest in with this next level of leadership and who are we sort of putting in the pipeline for our high pods and our high pods. And so there was one person whose name was on the list. It was a woman. And one of the senior leaders said, nope, I was in an elevator with that person and they didn't make eye contact with me. They're not high potential. And so how quickly there was just this sort of understanding of like the body language and the way that they interacted with me, it sort of like doesn't resonate for me like on what my expectation is. And the HR lead was like, whoa, okay, like let's start to unpack this. And, it took a lot of work and it's like, it was sort of an early days of shifting and transitioning for this organization to kind of really look at how they were looking at people. It was so ingrained for this leader that leadership looks a certain way or high potential looks a certain way that eye contact in an elevator on one exchange was enough to say, nope, that person's not what we think they are. So I think that's like maybe not a normal example, but there are things that we do and experience every day in our work where we're judging and making decisions on people that we work with, that we lead, that can be based on these sort of quick assessments or judgments around commitment and what is someone like as a worker. And there can be a deficit for women when they can't meet those. So if you think about someone who needs to work part-time or take time out for childcare, those are all sort of things that get penalized under this model of ideal worker, ideal leader. Any questions or comments about that? Okay, let's keep going.
Yeah, there was a question that did come up, and maybe you'd like to speak to it. But there's sort of where do you go about finding a mentor? And I know I'm certain certainly the programs that Minerva offers and and certainly Steph is here with us, CEO of Tap Network too, that can speak to that as well. But Tina, did you want to go ahead and answer that first? Just if
Yeah,
you have any
sure.
idea.
Sure. Mentorship is so interesting because I think for it to work well, the mentee needs to know what they need and what they're looking for. And I think most of us think like, oh, I can benefit from mentorship. Of course we can. We can benefit from learning from someone who's more experienced or sort of more skilled in certain ways. So my recommendation is to really sort of get quiet with yourself and think about like, what is it that I want to gain from working with a mentor? And there are formal programs. So you can reach out to me. I can share some with you. The Prosperity Project does a national free mentorship program where they put together mentors and mentees, sort of industry-based, sector-based. That's really great. I know Swiss has amazing mentorship programs locally here in British Columbia for women who are working in STEM. So you can find a formal program, but it's only going to work for you if you can really build that relationship with your mentor and if you know what you need and you want. So go into that sort of thinking about, okay, well, this is what I'm really trying to learn, or I'm navigating this kind of challenge at work and I want to help navigating that. And I think you can also find mentors in your space. So look around, who's someone that you admire, how you like how they work. Maybe they're in your workplace. Maybe they're only a couple of roles ahead of you. They don't necessarily need to be a senior person. So look for someone that you think, hey, I like how they do that. And maybe they're a person who can help me, and then approach them and say, I would like to I'm trying to work on this, and here's sort of my goals. And I'd love to have, 4 meetings with you to talk about these specific things. The more you can take sort of control of it, the more you're clear. You could ask almost anyone, and I guarantee you they would say yes, because people love to help people. But if you're not sure about what you want and you're not quite sure what you need, it's harder, and people might be more hesitant to step in because they might not know if they can help you, and may not want to feel responsibility for that. I'm happy to chat about that. You can reach out to me if you want to have a one-on-one or sort of like try and troubleshoot that. I'm really happy to try and problem solve that with you if you want to reach out after this call.
Amazing. And Steph, I know obviously Tap Network. Would you like to speak to mentorship?
Sure. Yeah, just I loved how Tina responded to that. So just add a couple of quick points that, yeah, if I can't remember who asked the question, but anyone that is a TAP Network member, we run a mentoring program each year, which is fantastic for folks. But a lot of professional associations run them as well. If you're looking for newcomers to Canada, there's organizations like Mosaic that run mentoring type programs. And there are wonderful programs out there, but I think Tina nailed it with be clear on what it is you're looking for, and there's mentors all around us.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Awesome. Back to you, Tina.
Great.
I'll pop these into the chat just so that they're handy for folks. Thanks.
Sounds good. So just sort of like to wrap up this piece, one of the things that I want you to think about in your work with yourself, if you lead others, if you're getting feedback that sort of isn't resonating, if you're not having the impact you want to have, is to start thinking about like, what might be some of those ideal worker things that are valued in our workplace? Like, are there some of those unwritten kind of expectations and values that it's hard for me to meet? So a really good example is if you are the primary caregiver in your home and you need to be home and pick up kids at 3 and you can't go to evening events or after, like that might be a very real barrier that you're facing in your workplace to be able to be seen as that committed, available worker, or to get some of those stretch assignments, plum assignments, if those are happening outside of the work hours. So really taking a look at like, are there things in my workplace where that expectation is there, written or unwritten, where people are rewarded and are valued for these kind of behaviors and things? And is there a gap or a reason that I can't meet those? The other thing is to look at like, what kind of feedback am I getting, and what kind of things maybe sort of falling into these stereotypical sort of ideas of how men and women should behave at work. I'm using language like masculine and feminine characteristics. I did this at webinar last week, and someone said, if you use language like agentic and communal, it sort of takes out the gender of it, which is very true. But we know that historically, men and women can be valued for different stereotypical characteristics that you're supposed to display. And so sometimes if you are a woman and you're not displaying those stereotypical feminine traits, some of them are here that you can sort of peruse. But if you are a woman and you're acting more leaderly, sort of more assertive, competitive, analytical, self-promotional, bold, that is sometimes punished in the workplace because you're not adhering to this sort of gender stereotype. So those are other things to pay attention to, is sort of when you're having a rub or when something's happening in the workplace where you're sort of making a decision or a judgment about someone and their behavior and how they're responding, is to check yourself and just see like, what's that based on? Is it based on actually like a behavior and an impact and an outcome that is not what we want in the workplace? Or is it based on how I sort of perceive and think that people should be acting? And you have to go a little layer deeper to see like, is there sort of a bias that's being triggered in me? Because these norms run deep and these expectations run deep, and it's not just men that have them or women. Like, we all have a degree of this. And so anytime you're working with people in a capacity of managing or supporting or thinking about promotion or salary or making a decision that sort of has an impact on their life and career, that's when you want to be extra, extra alert and careful that your judgments and decisions are based on behaviors that have an impact and an outcome that can be sort of spoken to in a tangible way, not sort of in this like, oh, well, she's this or she's more like that. And sort of getting into that like sort of personal feedback that is based on these beliefs of how people should act in the workplace. So I'm just conscious of time. I want to leave some room for questions, but when we think about today's workplace, we're not in this box anymore. None of us want to be in that box anymore. Our careers are non-linear. So whether you call it a roller coaster or a jungle gym, most of us are having careers that do have stops and starts. Sometimes we go in reverse. Sometimes we pivot. Sometimes we change. Our careers are not start at the end of school and push through till retirement and then stay in a straight line. It's just not the reality anymore. More of us have family and caregiving responsibilities, not just young children. We have elders. We may have folks with disabilities in our lives. Family and caregiving is increasingly something that we're paying attention to. Increasingly, different genders, different parents are taking responsibility for that. It still predominantly is sort of a woman's responsibility, but we're starting to see that conversation, whether it's about childcare or parental leave and paternity leave. It's becoming more and more common that family and caregiving has to be sort of factored into how the work gets done. More of us want balance and wellness. So yes, we're going to work hard and we're going to be committed and we'll put in the extra hours, but we also want to have health, balance, and wellness. And that's becoming increasingly a value that employers need to accommodate. For management and leadership, the ability to manage people in teams is, I would say, more important than sort of managing processes and systems, because ultimately it's the people who do the work, especially in knowledge-based work, tech sector. COVID really emphasized this, right? Like, no more did we have sort of personal life and work life separate. It was all smushed together. And leaders had to navigate realities for folks who were dealing with family and kids at home and illness and in some cases death. So like, it really sort of came to the forefront that we need leaders who can step into the whole conversation with folks and not just, well, I'm just here to kind of manage your work and the rest of your life messy over there, stay away. So I really feel like from a leadership perspective, the ability to manage people and teams is increasing, and that's really sort of leveled up and valued different kinds of traits and behaviors. And empathy is something, empathetic leadership, never seen it talked about before COVID. Increasingly now it's become a valued leadership trait and something that we want because we know it increases relationships in the workplace and engagement in the workplace. Being able to foster those inclusive environments. Increasingly, we're all working in more diverse communities. We're working with colleagues and coworkers who have different life experience, different perspectives, and learning how to do that well and work together. So the reality of today is not only as employees do we have to figure out how to do this, but our leaders have to be able to create those environments. I think also, instead of sort of coming to work and putting on that mask and putting on that suit and sort of like trying to fit a mold, there is a real push towards bringing your authentic self to work and being able to step into that. And I think from a leadership perspective, this is where the change will come. The more that this is encouraged and the more people can sort of step into roles, step into leadership, do things in a different way that doesn't sort of fit that suit and tie mold, is how we're going to sort of affect a lot of change in the workplace. And then growth. We all want growth. We want people to invest in us. We want to learn. We want to develop. We don't just want growth for the companies and our sort of KPIs and our outcomes and our business benefit, but we want it for people too. So all of these things are sort of conspiring and influencing sort of this old mold and norm that doesn't work anymore. And in some ways, that is opening the door to sort of broader inclusion and gender equality, because a lot of those old things do sort of carry back to a time when women's contribution to the workplace were less and women were valued less in the workplace. So ideas for action, what can we do? Obviously, there are so many ways that we can do things from a policy, procedural, structural perspective. I didn't highlight those here because I don't quite know who's in the room, and you may not have influence over that in your workplace. So I'm going to sort of focus on some of these problems of like what women are experiencing at work, what's sort of holding back around those leadership opportunities, critical assignments, less actionable feedback that we sort of learned in our research study. So what can you do? The number one thing is have awareness and open discussion. We in our research study, only about 29% of folks said that this is a conversation that's even happening at work and being sort of monitored or reported on, which is not surprising. If 70% of people think that it's not a problem, then why would we talk about it? But it is still happening. It is still an issue. And you can see from the stats in the tech sector, the brain drain is very real. So what's the awareness and open discussion? Finding ways to just start a conversation, whether it's with your team, whether it's with a couple of colleagues at work, like, hey, what do you think about this? Or you could share Minerva's research study, you know, hey, I read this. What is this? How does this land for you? What's your experience been in the workplace? Opening up with kind of curiosity and understanding to kind of build awareness is really where we want to start, so that we can understand what of this content is relevant to our workplace, what might not be. And once you sort of understand sort of what the experiences of people in your workplace are, then you can start to solve for it or have next steps opportunities. I encourage you to think about equity as a skill to develop. So as individuals, as leaders, as people who work in organizations, the more we can start to see where there are gaps and where the gaps maybe sort of the seems like it's a level playing field, but the outcomes are different, the more we can start to identify like, hey, outcomes are different, or this customer is having a different experience, or this employee is having a different experience. The better we can get at sort of assessing where there's a gap and sort of building for equity, the more valuable you're going to be as an employee. Leveling up your mentorship skills. So the three on the bottom are really to support women in the workplace. So learning how to be a mentor. Everyone can mentor. If you're 2 steps ahead of someone, you can mentor someone. So leveling up those mentorship skills, thinking about how you can go beyond advice giving, sharing your own story, to those opening doors, opening your network, giving people opportunity, advocating, recommending, supporting, and really trying to help advance someone's career. My friend Amal Masri, she works in Ontario, and she works to support immigrant racialized women to advance their careers. And her mantra is mentor one more. So find people to mentor, find people to support, and try to find people who are different from you and maybe not the person you normally take under your wing and mentor. Creating space for community and networks. It's so important in organizations, especially when there's a group that might be sort of a minority group or a less dominant group, to have that space for community, for network, for sharing, for building awareness, for being able to talk things through, sometimes to vent. Having those spaces really helps to create a sense of belonging, and also helps people to know that they're not alone. And then finally, investing in women's leadership development. I always say it's not because women need more help in being leaders that they're less competent as leaders. It's because often they are trying to fit into a construct, and maybe it's not even sort of explicitly stated, but often women are trying to fit a mold or sort of be a leader that they think they should be, that isn't authentic to them. And so when women can spend some time developing their leadership, understanding their strengths and their capacities, and stepping into a leadership that's more authentic, they're going to have more impact. So it's not that women need more help being leaders, that they're less natural leaders. It's that they aren't often encouraged or seen to be leaders in their own right in the way that they show up. And so giving them space to learn about that can actually unlock a lot of potential. Questions and answers. That's it for me in terms of sort of formal comments and data that I wanted to share with you. It looks like we have about 10 minutes. So I'm happy to answer questions if there are any, or I'd love to hear comments on how this resonates for you.
Thank you so much, Tina. Amazing. Yeah, it's really valuable to have this dialogue, and very grateful. And any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. Very happy to continue the conversation. I think maybe I can sort of just start things off. So, when we talk about, sort of the natural first steps that employers might take when they're trying to prioritize this as an issue in the workplace, is there, I wonder if you might speak to measurement or some of the pieces that might naturally happen within an organization to sort of get a bit of a baseline and know where you are. And so if you could just speak to maybe some of the tactical pieces around what employers might what the first steps might look like.
Well, I mean, measurement is critical, right? Especially if you are trying to change so the makeup of your workplace, or if you are trying to sort of increase the number of hires in one area. So I talk a lot about leadership because that's our content, but like everyone can be a leader in any seat. And the challenge of getting more women in leadership is probably not different than getting more women in engineering or sort of like in different sort of technical roles. So a big part is sort of knowing where you're at, and then also knowing sort of where the gaps are. So generally it's a hiring issue or it's a retention issue. So the first point of measurement is like, are we like not even attracting any women? Are we losing women, or both? And then that's kind of where you start to pay attention to like, okay, if we're trying to bring in more, let's say if we're trying to bring in more women and the pipeline isn't there and we can't hire and there's no one to hire, that's when the problem solving comes. Like, how do we expand that pool? How do we diversify our pool? How do we reach more applicants? How do we look at our job descriptions and perhaps neutralize the language to attract different people to our organization? So some of those strategies are really well articulated, and some very, very tactical things you can do that have a big impact. Changing language and job descriptions not only helps attract sort of women and gender diverse people, it actually increases your overall pool. More people apply to roles that are gender neutral. Research has borne that out, especially in engineering and technical type roles. So there's lots of things you can do. So I think the measurement part is like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Where are you trying to focus? And you can't do it all at once. And it is a slow road. And so it is a little bit of trial and error of testing and sort of seeing what the impact is. When you're hiring, the pool has to be much bigger, and the short list has to have more diverse candidates for you to hire more people. That's just the reality. And then retention, there's a lot of things that might be going on there. So you need to talk to your employees and sort of find out what their experiences are so that you know what's really happening for them in your workplace.
Amazing. The other thing that sort of jumped out at me is we had sort of a brief conversation about the lack of quality feedback that sometimes shows up in the workplace. And I wonder what you might suggest for people leaders in addressing this.
Yeah, so I think training, I think anyone who's managing people needs training on leadership, but certainly on how to give feedback and how to measure performance and measure feedback. I think often we're thrown into roles and we can be sort of activated on like, well, it's not going the way I want it to, or I'm not getting the outcomes, but I don't know why. And so, the sandwich model that many of us have learned is like not the best. So reading about feedback, understanding how to give good feedback, understanding how to communicate clearly, and knowing that if you're not giving someone constructive feedback that will help them perform better or solve a problem that you can see, if you don't tell them, it's actually hindering and holding someone back from achieving an outcome. So you kind of have to get over yourself in terms of the discomfort of having difficult conversations and learn how to give good feedback. And one of the things that I suggest is like, I do this with myself. If I have a team member where I'm like, okay, something's kind of like rubbing, or it's not kind of going, like, what's the real issue? I use that 5 whys, like, what's going on, and like, why do I feel this way? And why is this happening? And, I try to dig as deep as I can to figure out what might be the root of the impact of the outcome that's happening. So definitely training, practicing, building up that courage, and making sure that when someone walks away, they know what the issue is, and they also have a recommended next step of how to solve it.
Amazing. Okay, we've got a couple that have come in here. So I think this is a really important and interesting one. So what about when those norms or expectations that you had shared on one of the previous slides are being perpetuated sort of by women leaders
Yeah.
in the workplace?
they're perpetuated
And
by all of us. So like,
yeah,
I think that's the whole thing, right? I mean, we're all sort of raised and kind of like steeped in this culture and this, like, especially if we've kind of grown up in sort of a Western culture, right? It's like, these are the things we're led to believe, and sometimes we don't see them until they're impacting us. So I think that's part of the message, is like, all of us are sort of influenced and experiencing the impacts, the negative impacts sometimes of that gender stereotype, gender bias, that it's not just holding women back, it's holding all of us back. So I I think that, again, it's sort of the naming of it, and it's finding ways to find language. So creating relationships where you can bring up topics at work and bring them up. Hey, I'm sort of noticing, or I'm kind of wondering, or, this is something I've experienced in the workplace where, this is really valued, but this is like something I can't do because of this, or like, how do we reconcile this, or how can we create sort of equity in this situation? So yeah, I think that it's sort of finding ways to find courage and bravery to open up conversation. And sometimes those difficult conversations do need a little bit of, it needs to be more than one chat, it needs to be more than one conversation. So I come back to that recommendation of sort of finding ways to have these conversations on a more regular basis with your team, with your colleagues, not just on International Women's Day, but like, bringing it up more often to say, like, where are there ways that we can keep doing better?
Beautiful, thank you. Another quick question. I know we're almost at time here, but last question. So how do you think that work from home has changed how we're perceiving body language? I'm going to move my hands a lot. I'm just
Oh, that's a great question. I attended a session during COVID, and it talked about that, because like, I'm making eye contact with my camera, right? Like, I'm not looking at Kathy, like, I'm looking at my camera to make it look like I have eye contact here. So it was talking about the impact of technology on body language. Certainly, we know that work from home still activates a distance bias. So there is still, when you're out of the office and you're remote and you're distant, and maybe you've got colleagues who are going in more often, that still activates a bias where you're less thought about, you're perhaps seen as less committed. So even though work from home has been shown to be really beneficial for everyone, there's sort of this pullback from it. And when you have a workplace where maybe there's a hybrid, or there's sort of an alternate, for example, if women are taking advantage of work from home for that flexibility to manage home, that is still negatively impacting their careers in some ways if they are working with others who aren't taking advantage or showing up in the workplace more. So we still have to kind of be aware that work from home will activate some of those unconscious biases and those like real biases about who's committed and who's not.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Do you mind if we pop back into the deck? And I'm just going to briefly acknowledge our sponsors. I want to thank you again so much, Tina, for the terrific presentation and the dialogue. It's just such a valuable conversation. So I just first of all would like to thank we do an annual TAP Network does a diversity dashboard annually. These are our fantastic partners from last year, Innovate BC, Sun Life, and Invest Vancouver. Very, very grateful for their support. We're constantly looking for supporters for this work every year to fund it. And so if you are at all interested at any point, please feel free to reach out to me. On the next slide, we also have our sustainability partners, and very grateful to Innovate BC, Focus Professional Services, Northeastern University, UBC Saunders School of Business, and of course, we've got Lighthouse Labs and the Government of Canada that we're partnered with in terms of some of our work as well. And we're very, very grateful for all of our sponsors in making it that we can continue to curate content on the hub. And we're always looking for volunteers if you're interested in being part of the hub advisory, or you have bandwidth to be reviewing materials or helping us with that. We're very, very open to support. And of course, just again, this webinar, the intention is to put it up on the hub so that you can enjoy it in the future and share information with other leaders at your organization. And my email is in the chat there. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, ideas for sessions. Just very, very interested always in expanding our partners and our reach with this work. So thank you so much. Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.